This week marks the 30th anniversary of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which handed down its landmark final report on April 15, 1991. The report found major issues within the justice and judicial systems and the way Indigenous people are treated. There were 339 recommendations, but 3 decades later and a 2018 review found more than a third of the recommendations hadn't been fully implemented.
That review also found that since the 1991 report, the Indigenous incarceration rate has nearly doubled to 27% of all prisoners, despite Indigenous people making up about 3% of the Australian population. And perhaps even more concerning, since 1991, more than 470 Indigenous people have died in custody, and there have been at least 5 Indigenous deaths in March alone. Ken Wyatt is the Commonwealth Minister for Indigenous Australians and joins us from Perth. Welcome. How have things got so progressively worse?
I think what we've seen, Dan, is in the first 5 years, because I was part of the process and I was around at the time, there was rigour applied to the recommendations. But as we've had changes of government, changes of leadership within each of the jurisdictions who have responsibility for incarceration, the police, etc., I think we've seen progress made, but also our eye taken off the ball. And that's why in the Closing the Gap targets, there were 2 that were focused on incarceration rates of adults and incarceration rates of young people. And so we will probably go back to policy committees very similar to the justice committees that were established for that first 5 years of the Royal Commission report and focus and have a sharpened focus on how do we reduce the incarceration rates and what are some of the alternative models and how do we address the appalling underlying health issues that are prevalent in a lot of Aboriginal prisoners.
Minister, you mentioned you were there and involved at the start after that report and that you've been a part of different governments, firstly as a bureaucrat and now as the first Aboriginal Australian to hold a cabinet portfolio. What does it say to you that those things are getting worse, that if you're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander in Australia, that you are more likely to go to prison than you are to get a university education? And that the numbers of people that have died in custody, those Aboriginal people, has increased so dramatically?
Well, Dan, I am concerned that we have slipped in the areas of education, because I've always believed that if you have a good education, you have a better pathway to make better choices, and we're seeing this with our people who are making it to tertiary education. Those who don't tend to have poor health, live in poverty, and Nick Goodar, in a recent report, made the comment it's the underlying issues and the poverty that leads us into pathways that result in incarceration. But recidivism, we've got to break those cycles. And I've seen some practices in different jurisdictions where there is diversion from the courts. There are opportunities created to re-engage, and I think that we now need to take our minds back. And in talking with the Attorney General last week, with Michaelia Cash, both she and I talked about ways forward that I and the Minister for Home Affairs will discuss next week, that we will work in concert with state and territory jurisdictions and the relevant ministers and with our people, as I've said, co-designing better responses to what we're seeing now. Any death has an impact because you miss not only that person, but it flows on to levels of grief and anger, as we have seen, but frustration that it appears as though governments are not doing enough work to reduce incarceration rates, because that's where we've got to start, reduce the incarceration rates.
And Minister, it's not just that governments aren't doing enough. It appears in some instances that governments are actively doing all they can to hide this information. It was during an estimates process that some of the latest details about deaths in custody has emerged. What does that say to you in 2021?
Well, they're not hiding their data at all. In fact, the information is collected by the National Deaths in Custody group and the Australian Institute of Criminology. That data is provided to them, they analyse it, and then that is provided. Now, the agency that I am responsible for receives that data after the reports are written.
And sorry to jump in, Minister, but isn't this the problem? It's the time, the lag there, which is exactly what Linda Burney, your opposition number, called for, is that information, that data to be reported in real time.
Well, there is some real-time reporting occurring, but the other issue too is coronial inquiries. You need to look at the underlying matters there, and what does disturb me when I look at the data, even that The Guardian listed, the issue of underlying health being extremely problematic. Some of those health conditions, even here in the recent case in WA, we've got to go to better health outcomes and better health pathways for children and build towards a better future, better education, employment and engagement, because none of us want anything different to that. But what we're finding, and certainly Fiona Stanley's work in WA showed that a child who does not exit year 10 lives all those worst case scenarios and circumstances, and that's what I want to change, and that's what I want to work with governments. But I also want transparency in the information we provide.
When it comes to education, Minister, I was speaking with Lauren Moss, the Northern Territory's relatively new education minister this morning. She was talking about a program to get Aboriginal people from remote parts of the Northern Territory into teaching to stay in community. But she also seemed open to the idea of perhaps returning to community ownership of education, whether that includes bilingual or the two-way learning. What would you say to that?
Look, I welcome her thinking on this because I've had a couple of discussions with Minister Moss, and part of what we need to do is look at why aren't kids attending school? And if it means sitting with parents and with the community to say, well, what are we doing wrong? Because in one school where I read the retention rates, 87% of children do not attend. So why is that happening? And I like the concept of what she's talking about, but government should not let go of their responsibility in providing education to any child from those compulsory years of schooling. We have to remain engaged, but if we can do it in partnership with Aboriginal communities, as she's suggesting, then I would welcome that as a great outcome and a potential circuit breaker to the number of children who are disengaging from school.
Minister, just finally, we've heard comments on Q&A here on the ABC in recent weeks from Stan Grant, among others, saying that many of the issues that are emerging now are just simply not being looked at with an Indigenous lens. This was around, of course, what we've been hearing coming out of Parliament, as Stan Grant said, to the effect that it hadn't mattered when there'd been rallies around what's happening to Indigenous women in parts of the country. Does this go back to that fundamental question around truth-telling and having a full national conversation about what's happened in the past but where we're going into the future?
Dan, it's all of those. Truth-telling and telling the truth of our nation is absolutely critical. The work that Commissioner June Oscar has done in the 2000 Women's Voices, I now have taken carriage of that, and I will work with the Attorney-General on focusing on many of the issues that women have raised, because it does go back to the crux of what we're doing with the voice. I want to hear community voices, not the voices of those that we've listened to historically, not the national leadership. What I wanted to hear governments here, both at state and territory level and Commonwealth, are the voices of the people in the community who are affected on a daily basis and who the rest of Australia doesn't see. So that's where we are building the foundations through the work of the voice, but there are many other measures that we are working across government, and certainly in working with my parliamentary colleagues like Minister Tudge on education, we will see some reforms transpire over the coming couple of years.
On the voice, can Australians still contribute to that?
Yes, they can, but what's been interesting is the diversity of voices, the models that communities are saying they want, and we saw that reflected with one of the outback towns of New South Wales, where they said some of the national leaders and leaders in the state should come out to our community and see what's happening on the ground, because that's where you've got to fix the issues if you want the foundational elements addressed, and for a reduction in the terrible figures we see in every element of closing the gap.
Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt, we do appreciate your time. I'll have to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
And if you need information or support, you can contact Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. Or if you or someone you know is experiencing distress, please contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or the websites on your screen.